to, he and his parents walked over 200 miles to Lviv, I think is how you pronounced it now, Ukraine. They lived there under Russian domination until June of 1941, when Germany invaded it. And I'll let him tell the rest of his interesting and distressful story. And with that, Allan, we welcome you. We thank you. We appreciate you. And I'll mute myself and I'll listen.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I wish there was less correct factually, but it is accurate. You know, the first thing that I like to think about and to discuss is why talk about this? Why bother? Heck, it's ancient history, 75, 80 years ago. Who cares? Well, for those of us who are Jewish or know Jewish people or have any contact with Judaism, even if it's just intellectual, let me try to explain it. Just short of 40% of all the Jewish people alive were murdered. Just think about it. Whether it be Mobile, Alabama, or Miami, Florida, if nearly just about 1 out of every 2 people were murdered in your community, what do you think of that? And then you might say, well, it's ancient history. Who cares? Well, let me tell you something. Initially, my parents were very well educated. Even though they were not wealthy, they were very well educated. And my mom, who was a professional musician, graduate of conservatory, said Germans are enlightened people. They're well educated. They're the most cultured people in Europe. That was true, by the way, in 1939. This Hitler thing, this Nazi thing, is just a blip. Nothing to worry about. My dad, who was educated in Vienna, in Viennese university, by the way, the reason why he was educated in Vienna, although my dad came out of Poland, is because Poland had a quota system. And even though approximately 10% of the Polish population were Jewish, no university would accept a Jew beyond a 5% quota. So my dad went to Vienna and got educated there. And it saved our lives because he spoke German like a Viennese person. And during much of the war, he was mistaken for somebody from Austria. So my dad said to my mother, and I overheard all this, well, you may think it's a blip, but I read the German periodicals, I read the German newspapers, and it's really threatening. Well, this argument went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, my father realized there was no way to modify what my mother was going to say. And he said, he really grabbed a hold of me physically, pulled me by my arm, and started dragging me to the door. Actually, I went willingly, so it wasn't really dragging. Started pulling me to the door. And my mother looked at him and said, what are you doing? What's going on? And by that time, the Nazis, the Germans attacked Poland. This is now, we're talking about 1939. And my father said, I understand that I cannot convince you, but I'm going to take the boy, me, to Lviv. And it's further away from Germany. It's eastern Poland. It's actually part of Ukraine now. And I feel that I've got my support network over there. And here in Krakow, we're just too exposed to the Nazis. And I am scared of the Nazis. My mother was flabbergasted. She couldn't understand her child being taken away from her. And so what she did, she said, okay, crying and tearing, she said, okay, I'll come with you, but let me just say goodbye to my parents. And the only time I've ever heard my dad say something that was cruel to my mother, he said right then and there. He said, no, you cannot say goodbye to your parents. What my dad knew was that Jewish goodbyes take a long time. And we had no long time. By that time, wars had already been in progress for about 3 or 4 days. And sure enough, as we went outside, there was no more railroads, there were no more trains, there were no more airplanes, there were no more buses. We couldn't even take a taxi or a truck. And so we started walking. We walked about 200 and some odd miles eastward as the crow flies. We probably walked a lot more than that. And what happened was the military uses primarily the main highways and roads, and Poland was not that undeveloped, so there were highways there. And so we saw sometimes the Nazi troops ahead of us, but we went through the backwoods and we went through the side roads while they were heading down the main roads. And we saw the airplanes strafing and bombing, etc. And we avoided all that because we were away from the main highways. And so we're, at any rate, the reason I feel, and I got ahead of myself, the reason I feel it's essential to tell the story now and not to, excuse me, 1 second. Lori, well, hold on, there's a little bit of light that's bothering me. Just one moment. Thank you for your patience. At any rate, we almost died because my mother did not realize the risk. And the reason why that story is germane and important today, because folks, unless you are extraordinarily cautious and frankly have the ability to see in the future, we don't recognize the risk either. I must admit to you, when I saw the Capitol stormed, I thought I saw a reenactment of the Nazi era. It's not an issue of your political allegiance at all. In my mind, I saw the brown shirts all over again. Not only there, but wherever you go, whether you're talking about France today or Germany or everywhere else in the world, there is a ever-present danger, and we must never be caught asleep. That's why I think the story of the Holocaust is as important, as germane today, as it was 70 years ago. And I think the risk is always there. So now, what about you? Well, you might say, if you're Jewish, the risk is obvious. What about for those of us who may not be Jewish? In Europe, if you converted out of Judaism, the Nazis still thought you were Jewish. But when I speak to Christian groups, I point out something to them. Do you know that all of the without exception, early concentration camps were not built for Jews? Dachau, Belsen. They were built for Christians, not Jews. Auschwitz in first 2 years, 1939 to 1941, beginning of 42. There were no Jews there. It was all for Christians. Anybody who opposed Germans, anybody who opposed the Nazism, that's where they went. Many of them did not come back. In fact, I say this to my Christian audiences. You hear about the 6 million Jews, but what you don't hear, in the same concentration camps, in the same killing fields, 5 million Christians died. And if you really think that that's not enough to wake you up, in Europe, 80 million civilians, non-combatants, died in World War II. So if you think that you're immune because you're Christian, because you're Muslim or anything else, not true. As you know, Muslims are killing Muslims, Christians are killing Christians. Nobody's immune. So that's why I think the Holocaust story is important to each and every person. It's a clarion call. It's a wake-up call. It can happen to us. It can happen to me. It can happen to you tomorrow morning. and you need to be aware of it. So that's my introduction to myself, to my own presentation. As I started saying to you, we walked and we walked and we walked. And interesting, along the way, some people welcomed us in our house, in their home, and some people gave us food. And this was a multi-day, multi-week journey. Other people, religious people, Christian, Jews, said, no, God will take care of you, move along. Yet other people were so, they might have given us a meal, or they might have let us sleep in the barn. And at any rate, we came to a river, and we thought, it was just another river. But in that river, that was the river Bug, B-U-G. And my mom couldn't swim, my dad couldn't swim, neither could I. So all the bridges were bombed out, and we had never heard of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. At any rate, we found a ferry. We crossed the river in a ferry, and on the other side of the river, things were different. We walked from there a short distance to Lvov, and all of a sudden, things got back to, non-belligerency. We could not understand that. Well, my dad got a job. My dad was a native of Lvov. He got a job. We found an apartment when nobody else could find apartments. And life went back to normal, with one small exception. My mother, true to her word, still pining for not having said goodbye to her parents, would write a letter every day to her uncle, to her cousins, to her mother, to her sister, to her dad, to whoever. She went to her grave in 1994. She went to her grave, and she never knew why she never got a reply to a single letter. And now about 2000, maybe 2005, we found out why not. My wife and I, we were in Krakow, and there was a big square. And we saw some statuary, and we asked people, what's this about? And they said, well, all the Jews from, not just from Krakow, but from the area were brought in a square. And from this square, they were trucked to Plaszow, which is a concentration camp at the edge of Krakow. And from there, those people who survived there went to Auschwitz, and that was 1942. But the reason why my mother never got a reply is because she was writing to people who were dead, who by that time were killed. And so we were doing just fine until, you want to join me or not? Okay. So we were doing just fine until the Nazis attacked the Soviets. And this was June 1941. And so for 20 months, we were doing just fine under the Soviets. And as soon as the Nazis overran Lvov, which was a few days after the start of the hostilities, things got to be horrible for us. And the first thing was we were forced to go into a ghetto. Now, I had never heard the word ghetto. Remember, I never heard the word ghetto until I came to the United States. In Poland, there were some areas, just like here, where there were more Jews than other areas. And there were areas where there were few Jews. And so what the Nazis did, they kind of cordoned off. Originally, there were no walls. And they said, Jews must move into these 10, 20 blocks. And the Christians have to leave there. Well, wasn't pleasant, but okay, fine, no big deal. Then slowly but surely, the partitions, the fences, and subsequently the walls went up. And almost immediately when we were in the ghetto, food became a serious problem. And then people were taken and never heard from again. And people were taken on work parties involuntarily. There was no food. Now, somewhere along the line, as I said, my dad had a job, and his job continued. He was building a theater, which was almost complete by that time. And the only difference was that before the Nazis arrived, he was the boss. After the Nazis arrived, he had a Nazi boss who knew nothing about building, etc. And he just let my dad do whatever he wanted to do. And life went on as usual. My dad would come to work in the morning. By the way, the theater was in the Christian part of town. And then go back to the ghetto at night. And along the way, he would get us some food. And again, we managed to survive. But one day, he chanced upon a police officer, and the cop said, "You got a son, don't you?" My dad said, "Yeah, sure." Yeah. By that time, I was 7 years old. "Well, you better get him out of town. There's going to be a roundup of children." "What?" My father said, "What? Roundup of children? What are you talking about?" "Get him out of town." So out of abundance of caution, my dad found a safe house for me in a farmer's house and hired a railroad worker to take me over there. This railroad worker and I were walking down the street, and all of a sudden, right in front of me, there was a truck that pulled up and blocked off the end of the street. We turned around, went the other way, and we never got even to halfway across. Another truck blocked off the other end of the block, and all of a sudden I was wedged in between these two trucks. And it's because I was on the street, I was literally the first child taken in our children's roundup. And then they put me on the back of a truck, and I heard, what I saw was the Nazis going to the apartment houses, and I heard the crying, the begging, and screaming, because they went into the apartment houses and they grabbed the children from the parents. They wrestled the children from the parents, and I heard the crying. We brought the children down to where I was, and we were put on these various trucks. When the truck was full, they sent us someplace. I always thought it was a police station, because I always thought, if you did something wrong, you went to the police station. But I think I now have suspicions that it was a concentration camp. What I did not know, and I learned quite recently, that just outside of Lvov was a concentration camp. And so I think that's probably where I was taken. At any rate, I was there with this room corral, I should say, full of children. And I saw my dad come through the front door. And I thought I was going to be safe. All was going to be good. And my dad saw me because I was standing right next to a window. And our eyes locked. He went to see the head Nazi. Of course, he spoke brilliant German. They talked back and forth. And then my dad turned around and walked out of there and never even looked back at me. And I thought, that's it. I'm done. There's no chance for me. Came back 2 or 3 hours later. And this time I wasn't so happy to see him. And he talked to the same head Nazi again. And make a long story short, after a brief conversation, I saw the Nazi turn around and walk away. And my dad looked at me right now, like I'm looking at you, and went just like this. And he beckoned me. I knew where the door was. I came out of the corral, joined my dad, and we walked out of there. Well, I told that story to a woman who was interviewing me for the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She was startled. And she said that's, as far as she knew, I was the only survivor of many, many children's roundups. And since then, I've read a book which was relatively graphic, and I really could not get far into it, that spoke of these children's roundups and the misery that these children were kept in until they were murdered. And as far as I know, based upon what this woman said, I am the only survivor of the children roundup. I know my time is fairly limited, so I'm going to move along. So after that experience, we decided to start hiding. And the way we hid first in the attic above the theater where my dad was building. When we were discovered there by a maintenance man, we hid in a basement below a factory. Many things that I could tell you about each hiding place. But in any event, lastly, we decided that hiding in the ghetto or near the ghetto was just a matter of time until we would be found. And so finally, we decided to get some false ID papers and to pose as Christians and to go out. That's why my book's named Hiding in Plain View. Well, this worked reasonably well until one day, one of our landladies got suspicious, called the police. And actually, this was the second time. Another time, we just barely escaped. This time, we did not escape the police. We happened to be in Warsaw, and we went there because nobody knew us in Warsaw, whereas involved, people would recognize us. Krakow, people would recognize us because each of my parents was well known in their own community. So in Warsaw, we were picked up by the police, and they took us to the Germans, and the Germans said, they didn't look at us. Now, this is the important thing. We could have been Christians. They did not look at us. Send them across the street to a railroad station. That's all I knew. That railroad station, folks, was the place from which all the people from that railroad station went to Auschwitz. And I don't need to tell you what happened there. So the only reason I'm alive today is because that railroad station got so full of people, because the trains did not run for 5 days, that they released children like me to a orphanage in the Warsaw ghetto, knowing they could get us anytime they wanted. And I spent probably the most enjoyable time the entire World War II in the Warsaw ghetto, where I was being well taken care of by the workers in the orphanage. At any rate, a man came to the orphanage and said, "I'm here to take you to your parents." And of course, I trusted no one, and I would not go with him. And ultimately, the only way that he could persuade me to go with him is that the adults in the orphanage walked me out and locked me out of the orphanage. And then I had no choice but to go with him. And this man was trying to save my life. And in fact, he did save my life, but I gave him a real hard time. Make a long story short, he delivered me to my parents, and he was as good as could be, because he disappeared. And for the last 70 some odd years, I had always wished that I could say thank you to him, or if not, nothing else, to his family, because he really risked his life to save me. And it is amazing how many people did something like that. But I was back with my parents and back hiding in plain sight, and things were not going well. And so my dad happened to chance upon a German, might have been a Nazi, might have not, I'm not sure. And this German was complaining, moaning and groaning that he had an office in a Nazi headquarters building. It was the tallest building in Poland, second tallest building in Europe. And he had this two-room office that he was paying rent and had no use for. And my dad very nonchalantly says, "Oh, I have a little company, and I'll just take it off your hands." And so for the next 2 years, that was our hiding place in the Nazi headquarters building. And frankly, my mom and I hid in a closet, and there was not even a lock on the closet. But fortunately, the maintenance people that came in, security people that came in, they checked the front office, saw nobody there. A few of them even checked the back office, but nobody bothered ever looking in the closet. It was a vacant office. And so we were there for 2 years until the Warsaw Uprising. Not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which occurred 14 months earlier, but the Warsaw Uprising occurred when the Soviets were just outside of the Warsaw, and the Polish resistance thought that the Soviets were just a matter of a day or two from liberating Warsaw. They wanted to welcome the Germans in their own capital city. And the Soviets decided that they were not going to help the Polish resistance. And so little by little, the Germans eliminated the resistance fighters as they did with the ghetto. And we were back under German domination. But in order to show that their disdain for Poland, Germans said they will destroy the city. And by the way, any of you who might have been to Warsaw, the buildings in Warsaw, many of which look old, they're all been reproductions. The original city was totally destroyed. I could show you photographs of it, including the building where we hid. And for all these years, I thought we were just safe in that closet. But I saw recently, when I say recently, I'm talking about the last year or two, I saw a photograph of that building from a different direction. And to my shock, realized the very closet where we hid was a great big gaping hole right there. And had that air raid warden not flushed us out of the closet and forced us to go down to a bomb shelter, we would have been killed for sure, absolutely for sure. So once again, the only reason I'm alive is because somebody interceded, and again, it was a Polish Christian guy, and managed to save us. And for 75 years, I was blaming this man for exposing us to the general public, when in fact, he saved our lives. Well, once we were in this bomb shelter, everything seemed okay until a huge bomb penetrated the entire 16-story building, wound up in the bomb shelter with us, and had it exploded, we would have been vaporized. There would have been nothing there to bury. But in fact, this bomb was a dud, and we left that bomb shelter not knowing when it might explode. We went to another bomb shelter, and for me, another extraordinary thing happened. For 2.5 years, my mother and I were as close to each other physically as my wife and I. The furthest we were ever apart was about 4.5 feet. The people in the second bomb shelter, separated my mother and I by maybe 20 or 30 feet. We'd been to our bomb shelter after the war. And I was terrified. And they dropped a sheet between where my mother was and I. And my mother, realizing immediately that I would be scared, as in fact I was, started speaking to me from the other side of the sheet.
How old were you?
I was, at that point, 9.5 years old. And she said, "Oh, you'll be fine. Everything's fine. We're safe. Don't worry." And this went on for probably a day. And all of a sudden, I heard something which was really strange to me, because I thought I heard a cat. And in fact, there was no cat. By the way, the reason why it was so strange, because by that time, hunger was so acute. All the dogs had been eaten. All the cats had been eaten. I mean, literally, people would eat rats. If it was edible, people ate it. At any rate, that noise that I heard was the birth sounds of my baby brother, who was 2 pounds when he was born, and he was given no chance of survival, particularly because my mother had no breast milk. There are no women feeding babies. There was no milk to be had. And so one doctor saying, "Well, if you just want to feel better about doing something for this baby, give him some sugar water." It was an insane statement. We had not seen sugar for 4 years. But in fact, a bag of sugar, maybe 1 pound of sugar, showed up, and very carefully we would mix a little bit of water with the sugar and fed this baby. And this baby was supposed to die any moment. In fact, he did not die. And he lived, and I thought that his life was going to be my death, because we were not noticed. Everybody notices a newborn, especially one that's so small that you can fit in the palm of your hand. Well, all the people in Poland and Warsaw had to believe, and when they left, they had to go through checkpoints. We had no papers. We had no chance of survival at all. But a physician wanted to save the baby, this miraculous baby, put us on a hospital train with people who were wounded. And of course, these people did not have to have papers. And so we went out of Warsaw without going through a checkpoint, and we thought that we were heading to Germany. But in fact, that hospital train went right back to Krakow, the very place we started from. And there we were given shelter by Polish resistance. And 4 months later, we were liberated. Now, I'm a firm believer in living up to my time constraints. And I was told to speak for 30 to 45 minutes. I think I've spoken for 29 and a half minutes. So now I'm going to open up to questions, and I welcome your questions, and I caution you. If you do not ask me questions, I will just ramble on. I will take up my full 1 hour. But please give me whatever questions you have. But you gotta have to unmute yourself.
I'll start. First of all, thank you so much for your story. And I think I don't want to speak for the congregation, but I know for me it was very, very moving and very compelling. I've been to Krakow, I've been to Lvov, I've been to Warsaw, and just hearing you describe your journey and the distance and how you had to travel, it's more formidable than you have to sort of be there to sort of imagine. You told a journey from Krakow to like Lvov like it was nothing, but it really is something. In the best of circumstances, to do it on foot, to do it in wartime is miraculous, and it speaks very much to your resilience and to your parents. I have a very simple question. One of the things you mentioned was that you were in an orphanage. And were you in the orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto?
Yes.
And was Jan Korshak there at the time?
Okay, the adults there were so kind and so patient. And of course, I was accustomed to just the opposite. And I, for years, firmly believed I was in a Korshak orphanage.
Yeah, you may want to describe, I threw out a name and I'm not sure everybody on this might know who he is, please.
Jan Korshak is the notorious person because he was a major personality in both Christian and Jewish worlds. And he wrote children's books, etc. And he was given many opportunities to escape the Nazis, escape Poland. And he didn't, he refused. And he stayed with this orphanage that he initiated, he created. And in fact, he insisted on going with his children to Treblinka, where he was murdered with all the children in his orphanage. The people that I met in that orphanage, the adults, and I don't know, I can't tell you whether they were Jewish or Christian. I assume that they were mostly Jewish, but they might have been Christian. And I told you, the Nazis murdered people at random. But anyway, they were so kind to me that I thought for years that was the Korshak orphanage. Much to my horror, I subsequently realized I knew exactly the 5 days that the trains did not run to Auschwitz, and the reason I was taken to the orphanage. And much to my horror, found out, and by the way, all of these things are public and information, that the Korshak orphanage went to Treblinka 3 weeks before I was taken out of Umschlagplatz and taken to the orphanage. So it could not have been the Korshak orphanage. And perhaps one of the reasons why these adults were so kind to me, they may have known what happened to Korshak. And they knew if he couldn't survive and if his orphanage was not spared, then none of us really had a chance. So, but Rabbi, thank you for those kind words. Appreciate it. And by the way, anytime you want me to speak to an audience of one or more, one is enough, feel free to contact me.
Thank you for that generous offer, and we will. I'm sure we will do everything we can to abuse that privilege. You have a wonderful story and so meaningful for generations to follow. And I agree with you. It's just so important for them to hear it from the words of people who actually experienced it. So
and I think Christians need to hear it as much, if not more, than Jews, because oftentimes they have this false sense of security, which is truly false. So, anybody else wants to ask a question, please. Otherwise, I'll ramble on.
Allan, I want to ask something, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to express it very well. I've heard you speak a couple of times, and I've read your book, and I recall being raised in the temple in Mobile and hearing about and learning about the Holocaust. And it's always struck me, like it does many people, about how did such a thing happen, how and why. And as I got older, I remember 25 years ago seeing on C-SPAN an interview with a Harvard professor who you may or may not know, named Daniel Goldhagen.
I don't know.
And he wrote a book. He wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And I read that book. And it goes to the heart of my question. And of course, my family, like many of the Temple families, have immigrated many years before from Germany. But I've always tried to understand why the common, now there are exceptions. There were wonderful people that hid the Jews, Christians, and others. But how is it that the common German was complicit in the Holocaust by murdering, watching, turning a blind eye, not helping? How did that happen? And I think about that constantly. And of course, I know there was virulent anti-Semitism and there's no good answer, but I think about it all the time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's not. It sounds simplistic, the question, but it really is fairly complex. Part of the answer is people did object. People did resist, and they wound up in Belsen and Dachau, and places like that. Some were just shot on the street. A large number, and I can't tell you what the number is, of Germans were murdered by the Nazis. Secondly, there was latent anti-Semitism in Europe. Perhaps it wasn't so latent. But I got news for you. There is latent anti-Semitism in the United States, and France, and Germany. As a matter of fact, show me a country that doesn't have anti-Semitism. That certainly was part of the answer. Another part is there are people like my mother, and don't misunderstand, I love my mother dearly, but there are people who don't understand the risk. That's, and they were just the passive people who stand by and observe things going on and say, well, initially it's going to be nothing. And then they realize they were wrong. And then they say, I hope it passes by me that I'm not involved. So these are all parts of the answer to the total question. I can tell you, it's like the Chinese water torture. It is amazing what happens to you when drop by drop these hideous things start occurring, and each drop you can stand that drop, you can stand the next drop and the next drop, and even we Jews did not fight back, did not resist as we could have. So, and oftentimes, but on the other hand, I have people ask me, well, why didn't Jews fight back? Well, I got news for you. Even if there's 20 or 30 of us, and 2 of them, and they're armed with rifles and pistols, and we're not, it's not a fair fight. So I hope that answers your question.
lot has been written, particularly there is a French priest who has written a book about complicity by inaction.
I think the rabbi was going to have a comment about my question. Rabbi?
Yeah, I always like to bring to our consciousness that nothing on this massive scale had ever happened before. And I think it would be difficult for people to believe until it became really too late. We didn't have CNN. They didn't have the internet. Things traveled by word of mouth. It wasn't a very different set of circumstances. That's just my comment, but I certainly would welcome Allan and Lori's comment on that. The access to news, the sense of what was happening happened so quickly that people didn't really have time. Also, my understanding of Jewish history in that period and before was that Jews were very adaptive. They weren't trained to fight. They adapted unbelievably for 1,000 years, for 2,000 years. And then the game changed so rapidly that it didn't matter whether the Jews believed in Jesus or not. It was that they were simply Jews, under Nazi, quote, pseudo philosophy, so to speak. And
1/4 Jewish is enough.
What's that?
1/4 and 1/8 Jewish is enough.
Yes, exactly. Please. So I didn't want to say too much
Well,
on that.
I don't.
It's a great question. Great question.
I don't pretend to be a historian, and believe me, I'm no expert, but maybe the premise of my question was even slightly off, because obviously, historically, the anti-Semitism in Germany existed well prior to 1941. I mean, Kristallnacht was when, in 1933-ish?
No,
29, I can't.
38.
Well, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe in the early 1930s, with the Jews being branded, mistreated, etc. My understanding from the book that I read, Rabbi, do you know this scholar? You indicated, do you know who Goldhag? I was under the impression, maybe the misimpression, that, I mean, even if you step back, American intelligence knew about the concentration camps. But I was under the impression that the common German in Germany, the majority of them, knew what was happening, and they saw with their own eyes the mistreatment being paraded around the walks. And so, again, I'm getting philosophical, and you've answered my question. And I think about it because people ask, could it happen again? And you always say, there's no way in the world that could ever happen again, but it could happen again. But I have a hard time understanding the torture, the experiments, the murder that was going on with, again, there were heroes, but many of the Germans turning a blind eye and being complicit with it.
You see, the only reason I speak, by the way, up until probably 20 years ago, I almost never spoke. And the only reason I speak, because I try to convince people as best as I can that it can happen again. It can happen again to whoever's listening. It can happen here or anywhere. And I pray that people hear me. You see, it is happening again. Again, right now. I'm sure that you've heard of Rwanda. I'm sure that you've heard of China with Afghanistan. You name it, it's happening all over the world. And just because it's happening to them and not us doesn't mean that we're immune. Human beings have an amazing capacity for inhumanity towards their own kind. And so the only reason I speak, and by the way, it is never pleasant for me to recount those memories, but the only reason I speak is to alert people and to beware that it can happen, and to do whatever is necessary, including running for public office, including resisting. One of the things I often speak to, I always speak to kids, and I tell them, bullying is where it starts. Bullying in school, bullying on the internet is how it starts. the brown shirts were nothing but the common thugs, the street people, the people that couldn't make a decent living. And so the criminals, got in charge. And don't think that we don't have a criminal element here. And don't think that we don't have bullies here. They're in junior high school, they're in high school,
They're in
they're
elementary
everywhere.
school, they're on the playground.
And you know what the greatest risk in my judgment? The internet. Because in internet, without identifying yourself, you can say the most vile things without repercussions.
impunity.
Yeah, with impunity. And so my feeling is, as well, I was standing in Auschwitz on the ground, and I was interviewed. I don't remember if it was an American news agency or Polish, one of the two. And they asked me for my feelings, what did I consider the greatest threat today? And my answer was one word. And I just gave it to you, the internet. That is the highest risk that I can think of because of the garbage, of the poison that is propounded on the internet. Next question.
I'd have a question or I'd have a comment, if you don't mind. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, two things about anti-Semitism in Germany before the war. One of my cousins, a cousin, Leo Sternberg, was in the German army during the First World War. He was given a medal for bravery during the war. He was given the Bronze Star for bravery, but it was a Bronze Star second class because he was Jewish. They could give him the star because of his bravery, but it couldn't be the real star because he was Jewish.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, my parents, my father and my uncles got a lot of these people out of Germany in the early 30s before all of this started. Once the schools were closed to Jewish children, that they started trying to get them out, and they did. They settled in Baton Rouge, and I spoke to cousin Leo and said, I heard about your medal. What did you do with it? And he says, well, in the Second World War, I took, they had to drive for metal to make bullets. And I took that metal, threw it on the pot to kill Germans. So that was
nice story.
one. I don't want to take too much time, but there's another story, and that is that I visited Germany first in 1953 on a bicycle with a student group. Nobody thought we were Americans because Americans didn't go on bicycles. And I found that there was denial with a lot of people that we talked to. I came back in 1958, this time in the Air Force, and I spent a month working in the hospital in Wiesbaden with a lot of German nationals there, and also living, working walking in the town and everything else. And I had the feeling that there was such respect for authority in the German people that if the right man rose up again, they would do it all over again. It was just this respect for authority that had a great deal to do with it. Thank you very much.
I think you're right. I think that that is a part of the German ethos. But don't misunderstand. There was no such respect for authority in Poland, and yet it happened in Poland. So it can happen anywhere. Next question, please. I guess we're done. Unless you want me. Well, let me tell you one more story, because it's kind of a cute story that might interest you. My dad was very inventive. He did all kinds of things for money to survive. One of the things he did was, when he got needed false identification papers, he befriended, my dad could befriend anybody at any time. He befriended the folks that made these ID papers. And I don't remember, I saw a movie just recently. It was not unusual for people to be manufacturing false identifications. And so in this case, my dad got to talk to him, et cetera. He said, well, how many do you do of these? And they said, not very many, et cetera. Anyway, he said, would you like to do more? Of course, yes. Well, let me be your marketing manager. Let me be in charge of trying to get you more business. And that's how my dad got involved with these folks. Well, when we wound up back in Krakow, towards the end of the war, by that time, we got back in touch with these folks, and they were actually part of the Polish resistance. We didn't know it. See, one of the things that people don't realize is, in times when things are very serious and very bad, you don't know who's your friend and who's your enemy. And so when we wound up back in Krakow with this little newborn baby, they gave us shelter. And so we're part of the Polish underground. I don't think they knew we were Jewish, but it didn't really make that much difference. It was close to the end of the war. Although the Germans and their sympathizers, of whom there were many, would hunt the Jews down literally to the last day of the German occupation, and some Jews died even afterwards. But anyway, so we were under German protection. And so after the war, my dad was contacting. He said, well, you have all these friends in the underground. Would you like to be part of the Polish government? My dad said, sure. He needed a job. I said, my dad, who was before an insurance executive, became part of the Polish finance ministry. And his job was to bring the insurance companies back to Poland. And so he knew nothing about Soviets he knew Nazis, they were our enemies. Soviets were our friends. They liberated us. So, but he didn't understand East versus West. And he was trying to get insurance companies to come into Poland. And so he traveled to Switzerland, where there were still insurance companies, to Sweden, to England, and anywhere where there were insurance companies trying to bring him back to Poland. Well, he came up on a Soviet radar, and they perceived him as a sympathizer of the West, and he was to be eliminated. The way they eliminated people in those days, one middle of the night, and there was no sense running, because two uniformed guys, they always came between 2 and 4 in the morning, 2 uniformed guys, 3 plainclothesmen, some of them wearing long leather coats. And because my dad was a high official in the government, they let him get dressed. They didn't just drag him in his pajamas off to prison. And he was taken to prison. And he would ask over and over again, what's my charge? What did I do wrong? Why are you taking me to prison? No response. One day, about a couple months, he was in prison. Oh yeah, I saw him in prison. Yes, of course. And one day, the warden or deputy warden, I'm not sure which, said, you're going to Siberia. And mom and dad, I should say dad, couldn't understand why. But when he pursued to ask questions, no response, you're going to Siberia. Make a long story short, he was sent on a train, and they didn't go Siberia to one stop. He went from one prison to the next prison to the next prison, until ultimately he was going to wind up in Siberia. Meanwhile, my mother knew that the Soviets used families as a hostage. So if my dad just misbehaved or tried to escape, they would round us up, put us in front of a wall, and we're dead. So my mother took my brother and I, at this time my brother was about 20 months old, maybe 21 months old. Yeah, just about that. And sent us, I was 11, sent us through a DP camp, from one DP camp to the next, to the next,
DP means
displaced persons. And we were supposed to go to Trieste and from there take a boat to Israel, Palestine. There was no Israel. And those are my instructions. So with this 21-month-old baby on my back, I went from DP camp to DP camp. And the last thing my mother said to me is, be sure they don't find you. Now we talked, this is code talk. I knew who they were, and I knew how to do it. So every time I went to a different camp, I would change my name. And so nobody could track me. The only way, if you knew how, there was only one way. In fact, she was right. My dad broke out of prison, escaped, joined my mother, and they took a railroad, and mom secreted my dad's diplomatic passports and hers, and they wound up in Paris. And then they started looking for us. Well, she realized very quickly what I was doing, and there was no sense looking for us that by name. So they started looking for two children, approximately a 2-year-old and an 11-year-old, going towards Palestine from Poland. And they probably visited several other pairs. I know I can say probably because I wasn't there, but that's what they told me. And so when they finally came upon us, and my brother was in the hospital at the time because he had measles. Of course, when my parents found out he was in the hospital, they were horrified. And they found us, we went to the hospital and he was okay. And we're reunited. We went to Paris, stayed there for several months, and we had diplomatic passports. In those days, it's not like today, we did not need a visa to come to the United States. The diplomatic passports were sufficient. And so we just had to have transportation. Finally, our uncles who were here in the US got us tickets, airline tickets, American Airlines, and we flew into LaGuardia. And I want to tell you about my first impression of the United States, because it's really so telling. I'd seen Europe, which was dark, with the blackouts, etc., even after World War II, very few lights. And I looked out, and I can still tell you, my right side of the airplane, I didn't have the window seat. I had the aisle seat. And I looked out, and I saw this sea, this absolute ocean of light. And I was flabbergasted. I'd never seen anything like it. That was my introduction to the United States. My second impression of the United States was we were met by Uncle and Aunt, and there's a long story about that, how we finally got out of the airport. And we went to my Uncle and Aunt's house. And my aunt opened the refrigerator, and I was aghast. I had never seen that much food in my life. I was used to an icebox. And I looked at something that was totally unfamiliar to me, and I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Butter." I knew in Polish it's the word is similar, and I had never seen a stick of butter. And so may I have it? She would have given me the house. Of course I could have it. So like a lollipop, I stuck it in my mouth, and I ate the whole thing. And it was delicious. I asked for a second one. I never got through the second one. I was so sick. It took me days to die. At any rate, being a newcomer in another country, it's got its vicissitudes. So I hope that I'll leave you on a more cheerful note.
Allan, let me just say on behalf of the Temple and the Adult Education Committee, this was quite wonderful. You're so generous with your time. I know you've spoken to the Temple at least 3 times because I've heard all 3 of them, maybe more than that. Your offer to the rabbi and to the Spring Hill College class is just very generous. You're very lucky to be alive. And
you're telling me.
yeah, I recommend your book to everybody here. I also want to thank your I also want to thank Lori Gold for participating, but I want to say a special thank you to Howard and Patricia Silverman, because but for them, you would not have found us. So unless anybody else has any parting comments, this was quite wonderful and insightful, and we appreciate your time and thank you.
Very much so. Thank you.
And you have proof positive that I adhere to your 1 hour sessions.
You're right on it. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Pleasure.
everybody.
Nice to
Thank
be
you.
with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.